Case 1. Sylvester. There is a moment in the late 1970s when the lights inside a packed San Francisco nightclub dim, the bass hums, and every head turns toward the figure emerging from backstage. Sequins catch the spotlight like shattered glass. The stage smells like hairspray, sweat, and hope. Sylvester steps up to the mic with the confidence of someone who has stopped apologizing for existing. From the very first note of You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real, a truth pulses under the music. This is a queer black man claiming space in an industry where authenticity is usually a liability. He isn't hiding behind coded lyrics or carefully curated public images. He is living out loud, in a time when that choice came with real consequences. In an era when most artists were pressured to bury their personal lives beneath radio-friendly illusions, Sylvester's performance was a declaration that what he was already enough. Born Sylvester James Jr. and raised in a religious household in Los Angeles, he learned early how to make a voice move people. Choir lofts were his training ground, but by the time he reached San Francisco, he had created an entirely new language of performance, part gospel, part disco, part insurgent joy. He wasn't shy about being openly gay, effeminate, or flamboyant, and that authenticity drew people who were tired of pretending to be someone else. His shows became sanctuaries, loud and glittering and unstoppable, places where outsiders suddenly weren't outsiders anymore. It's impossible to tell the story of queer R&B and disco without Sylvester because he made it visible. Every falsetto run, every shimmer of rhinestone, every refusal to mute himself was a direct challenge to the unwritten rule that black artists, especially male ones, must present a certain image to succeed. Of course, the industry didn't make that rebellion easy. Behind the glamour were contract disputes, record execs who didn't know what to do with that gay singer, and relentless questions about why he wouldn't tone it down. Radio stations loved the hits but tiptoed around acknowledging the person who made them. Interviewers tried to steer conversations toward universal themes, code for avoiding queerness altogether. Sylvester refused. He talked about queer life, about the joy of chosen family, about the dangers of shame, long before mainstream culture had language for any of it. The backlash came in whispers and closed doors rather than public outrage. But he felt it. Deals dropped, invitations rescinded, executives uncomfortable with seeing someone so free. Yet in that resistance, he found another kind of success, one measured not in chart positions but in liberation. LGBTQ+ audiences saw themselves reflected in a soul voice that didn't bother to disguise its identity. Sylvester's concerts weren't just concerts, they were affirmations. He also became deeply involved in the emerging LGBTQ+ community in San Francisco, showing up long before corporate sponsorships or rainbow merchandise were common. His art and activism fused into one purpose: telling the truth about who he was without apology. Behind the triumph, however, there was also tragedy. The AIDS crisis hit San Francisco hard, and Sylvester watched friends and bandmates vanish, one by one. When he was diagnosed himself, he chose honesty again, speaking publicly about his illness, urging others to get tested, and refusing to let fear or stigma erase him. Even in his final months, he planned his funeral like a performance. Gospel choir, radiant music, no shame. He died in 1988, and San Francisco shut down streets for the memorial. It wasn't the record labels, critics, or executives who showed up. It was the community he fought to stand beside, queer, black, and unashamed. Sylvester's legacy lives not only in the music that still fills dance floors today, but in every LGBTQ+ artist who knows they don't have to disappear to succeed. He didn't survive by hiding. He lived by being real, mightily real, in a world that told him he shouldn't exist. If you appreciate honest storytelling, if you believe music history should include the parts that were whispered about, erased, or ignored, then welcome to Savage Case Files. Every day we go beyond nostalgia and celebrity to dig into the truth behind the songs, the lives, and the legacies that shaped culture. We don't shy away from complexity. We preserve it, because every artist's story deserves to be told fully and accurately. If you love deep dive music documentaries, if you support research, remembrance, and respect for the people who made the soundtrack of our lives, then please subscribe. Your support helps us uncover the hidden stories behind legendary voices, and it keeps this channel going, episode after episode. Hit that button, because we have 9 more powerful, emotional, unforgettable cases ahead. Stories that changed music forever. Case 2. Billy Preston. There is a quiet sadness in the way Billy Preston's story unfolds, because unlike the bold declarations of Sylvester, Preston's personal truth emerged slowly, cautiously, and mostly later in life, almost like a whisper against decades of silence. Here was a prodigy, playing keyboards with Little Richard before he could legally drive, trading riffs with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and releasing solo hits that became part of America's musical memory. Millions knew the groove of Nothing from Nothing and Will It Go Round in Circles, but very few understood the internal weight Preston carried. During peak moments of fame, he lived inside an industry that rewarded charisma but punished honesty. Especially when it came to sexuality, it wasn't until later years, through interviews, biographies, and recollections of bandmates, that a fuller picture emerged. Preston identifying as a gay man, hiding that truth throughout most of his career because honesty might have cost him work, respect, or safety in a time when being openly LGBTQ+ could end a contract overnight. His reluctance didn't come from shame. It came from survival. Prestigious tours, television appearances, and major collaborations meant everything was on the line if word slipped. Insiders described coded conversations, trusted confidants, and the painful balancing act of maintaining authenticity while staying invisible. Meanwhile, the public image portrayed a slick performer with boundless joy behind his keyboards. Those close to him later said that Billy feared exposure would destroy not just his career, but the respect of gospel-rooted audiences who embraced R&B while still carrying stigma from the church. Prejudice lurked everywhere, so he remained guarded, letting the music speak louder than identity. Eventually, truth won. In the years after his peak, friends and colleagues finally confirmed what was long suspected. It wasn't an explosive coming-out moment, but a gradual clarity that came through memoirs and testimony. Researchers, LGBTQ+ historians, and journalists began reclaiming Billy Preston's narrative, insisting that the silence around his sexuality not erase his impact, and something powerful happened. Instead of being reduced to rumors, Preston became honored as a queer figure in music history, someone who paved paths through talent, even when authenticity wasn't socially safe. Today, his story is not about scandal, it's about legacy. It's about an artist whose voice shaped popular music, whose organ solos electrified stadiums, and whose quiet truth finally became part of his history. In the evolving conversation around LGBTQ+ representation in R&B, Billy Preston's name now sits where it always belonged, among pioneers, not just performers. Case 3. Rahsaan Patterson. The journey continues with Rahsaan Patterson, a singer whose voice has always carried a mellow honesty, even before the world understood just how much truth was behind it. Long before his public coming out, Patterson was known primarily for one thing, being one of the most effortlessly gifted vocalists of the 1990s R&B generation. He emerged from the same era that produced artists obsessed with image management and tightly guarded personal lives. And yet his sound had an openness that seemed almost defiant, a refusal to hide behind studio gloss. Songs like Where You Are and Stop By put him on the radar of soul fans who wanted vulnerability without theatrics. But for years, the conversation about his sexuality hovered quietly in the background, carefully avoided by the record label, ignored in interviews, and passed around as rumor in industry circles that feared pushing an openly queer identity into mainstream R&B would crush a career. That silence finally broke in 2007 when Rahsaan sat down with Out magazine and spoke openly and plainly about being a gay man. There was no spectacle, no dramatic reveal, no staged moment. Just a simple human truth. He was tired of living as if his own story needed to be softened for anyone's comfort. In an era when the music business still treated sexuality as a currency, Patterson's decision wasn't marketed as an angle or leveraged as controversy. It was a personal shift into authenticity. Fans, particularly Black LGBTQ+ listeners, recognized immediately what that meant. There is a different kind of bravery in simply saying, "This is who I am," with no expectation of applause and no fear of backlash. And Patterson's artistry didn't change after he came out. If anything, it deepened. Albums like Bluephoria and Heroes and Gods became layered with spiritual searching, emotional complexity, and a kind of liberation only achieved when the secret weight is gone. The consequences weren't loud or scandalous, but they were real. There were fewer commercial pushes from major labels, less traditional radio support, and a quieter place within mainstream R&B marketing machines that preferred predictable narratives. But there was something far more valuable gained. A loyal, dedicated audience that saw themselves in his music. Unfiltered, Rahsaan Patterson became more than a singer. He became a touchstone for queer soul music, proving that authenticity has a longevity manufactured image could never buy. In the legacy of Black R&B artists who chose truth over silence, Patterson stands tall, not for a headline-grabbing confession, but for choosing honesty when the industry would have preferred a mask. Case 4. Frank Ocean. There was no press conference, no staged declaration, no carefully scripted publicist statement. Just a spare, vulnerable, open letter posted quietly on Tumblr in July 2012. One paragraph in that letter detonated across the entire music industry. Frank Ocean telling the world that the first love of his life was a man. He didn't wrap the confession in metaphor or cloak it in coded language. He wrote it plainly, almost gently, as if he understood this truth might break something, but might also build something new. At that moment, Frank Ocean wasn't just releasing a statement, he was challenging decades of silence, fear, and unspoken rules in R&B and hip-hop culture. For generations, queer artists survived by concealment or by letting others guess. Frank confronted that legacy head-on, and he did it at the very height of anticipation for his debut studio album. Before that letter, Frank Ocean was already poised for greatness. His songwriting credits stretched across the industry, working with artists like Beyoncé and Justin Bieber, but it was his own mixtape, Nostalgia, Ultra, that cemented him as a singular voice, introspective, poetic, textured with pain and longing. Yet even as the music world praised his artistry, no one knew the personal torment swirling beneath. The idea of publicly acknowledging same-sex love in a genre historically hostile to queer identities was, in 2012, unimaginable for most. Frank knew full well that artists had lost radio support, endorsements, friendships, even safety by being honest. Many believed his career might nosedive overnight. Instead, something remarkable happened. The backlash arrived, of course. Anonymous online threats, judgmental comments, and whispers from industry figures who preferred that he had stayed silent. But the support was louder. Beyoncé posted a message backing him. Jay-Z called his decision fearless. Music journalists hailed the moment as the most important cultural shift in R&B since Marvin Gaye reinvented vulnerability. Fans flooded comment sections, saying they finally felt seen, understood, and represented. Frank had done what no major male R&B artist had achieved on such a scale. He made tenderness toward another man not a scandal, but a work of art. That same week, Channel Orange was released. Instead of collapsing, his career erupted. Award nominations poured in. He dominated critical year-end lists. The narrative shifted from risk to revolution. The song suddenly held new layers: the ache in Bad Religion, the confessions of Thinkin' 'Bout You, the melancholy honesty threaded through every verse. Listeners replayed the album, discovering meanings they hadn't heard before because suddenly they understood who Frank had been singing to. His vulnerability humanized a genre that had long armored itself in machismo and secrecy. But Frank Ocean didn't try to become the spokesperson for anyone else's identity. He refused labels, refused to flatten himself into categories for public consumption. He simply continued making music on his own terms: elusive, brilliant, anti-celebrity. He became even more selective with interviews and appearances, reinforcing the idea that his artistry would speak where he preferred silence. The letter faded from headlines, but its cultural consequences did not. Young black queer artists cite that Tumblr post as their permission slip to live transparent lives. Industry executives tell stories about how the stigma around LGBTQ+ artists changed after that moment. The impact didn't stop with awards or think pieces. It rippled into everyday life, especially for fans who saw themselves reflected for the first time in a star who never traded authenticity for approval. By choosing honesty instead of fear, Frank Ocean carved out space in R&B's future that can never be closed again. Case 5. Meshell Ndegeocello. There is a quiet kind of rebellion in the way Meshell Ndegeocello has always made music. Stripped of pretense, untethered from commercial expectations, and defiantly rooted in truth. Long before major record labels figured out how to market queer R&B, Meshell stood in front of interviewers in the early 1990s and refused to hide. She did not announce anything dramatic. She simply existed openly, talked openly, loved openly. In an era when the industry still rewarded artists for coded storytelling and punished them for honesty, she used her art as a declaration of identity. Rolling Stone wrote about her fearlessness. The Advocate celebrated her visibility. She became one of the first widely recognized, openly queer voices in mainstream black music, not as a gimmick, but as a fully realized human being who refused to apologize for authenticity. Her rise began with a sound that resisted neat categorization: part neo-soul, part funk, part spoken word, part confessional jazz. If That's Your Boyfriend, He Wasn't Last Night hit in 1993 with a mix of swagger and vulnerability, making listeners lean in closer. In that song, and in so many others, she challenged possessiveness, gender norms, and the unspoken rules of romantic storytelling in R&B. Industry executives didn't know where to place her, but audiences did. She created a space for queer black listeners who rarely saw themselves reflected in mainstream love songs. She wrote about desire without erasing the gender of her partners, about heartbreak without rewriting pronouns for commercial safety. Each album felt like a journal left open on the table, raw, unsorted, and startling in its honesty. But honesty came with a cost. The same openness that made her a pioneer also made her a target. Conservative critics labeled her controversial, while radio programmers quietly avoided records that didn't fit neatly into their formats. The music industry was comfortable with queer stylings when they could be coded or disguised, but Meshell wasn't interested in disguise. She challenged journalists who tried to sensationalize her sexuality, redirecting conversations back to the art, back to musicianship, production techniques, and lyrical depth. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She was simply unwilling to lie. And because of that, a generation of LGBTQ+ artists would later look back and recognize her work not only as entertainment, but as a cultural turning point. Behind the stage lights and recording booths was a deeply introspective creator, unafraid to tackle trauma and identity with complexity rather than sound bites. She addressed faith, gender, family, internal conflict, and societal expectation with a whisper instead of a shout. She wasn't built for scandal headlines. She built legacies. Her music appeared in films, TV, and college lecture halls. She collaborated with legends and newcomers alike, always gravitating toward creative spaces that allowed honesty to breathe. And while other artists hid their orientation for decades, Michelle's transparency in interviews and album liners gave permission to countless fans who desperately needed someone to show them that their stories belonged in music too. Today, her legacy is woven into the DNA of queer R&B history. Critics call her a pioneer not because she performed activism speeches on award stages, but because she never edited herself for industry comfort. Younger artists, especially queer and non-binary musicians, have spoken openly about how her presence gave them room to exist authentically in their craft. She never aimed to carry a movement, yet she became one of its most essential voices. Michelle Ndegeocello changed R&B simply by telling the truth. And in a business built on images and masks, that kind of honesty remains revolutionary. Case 6. Johnny Mathis. Long before coming out was a media event, Johnny Mathis was already one of the most recognizable voices in America, pouring velvet into radios from coast to coast. His career floated on a kind of dreamy elegance. Chances Are, Misty, Wonderful, Wonderful, songs that defined entire decades of slow dances, Sunday Mornings, and First Loves. He became the soft-spoken embodiment of romance, a counterweight to the turbulence of those years. Yet underneath that perfectly polished public image was a battle that almost no one in mainstream culture was willing to acknowledge, much less embrace. In a 1982 interview with Us magazine, Mathis casually referenced his sexuality, a moment so quiet and understated that it almost slipped past unnoticed at first. But the fallout arrived quickly. In a country still decades away from any real acceptance, the fact that a beloved crooner might be gay sent shockwaves through fans who didn't know how to reconcile the intimate voice they adored with an identity they had never expected. Mathis later spoke about how those years were complicated by fear. Fear of major sponsors abandoning him, fear of concert cancellations, fear of damaging a legacy he'd spent a lifetime building note by note. The music industry, especially at that time, had a ruthless, unspoken rule: be whoever you want behind closed doors, but in public, maintain the illusion. And so Mathis did what so many LGBTQ+ artists of his era were forced to do. He returned to silence. Interviews were pulled. Comments were buried. For years, he avoided speaking publicly about anything personal, surrounding himself with music rather than headlines. That silence became its own kind of survival strategy, protecting a career that seemed too fragile to risk on honesty. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, even in whispered conversations and carefully worded profiles. By the 1990s and 2000s, everything around Mathis had shifted. Public conversations about LGBTQ+ artists grew louder. Fame became less connected to secrecy and more to authenticity. And when journalists circled back asking about the 1982 comment, he confirmed what many had suspected, but this time without shrinking from it. He spoke gently about how the world had changed, how younger artists like Sylvester, Frank Ocean, Michelle Ndegeocello, and Billy Preston forced open doors he never felt safe walking through in his prime. Eventually, Mathis became something of a paradox, an icon from the conservative era of polished crooners, and also a quiet pioneer of LGBTQ+ presence in Black American music. Looking back, there was no dramatic coming-out moment for Johnny Mathis, no letter posted online, no televised interview presented as confession. It was more like an unfolding truth, shared piece by piece over decades. His impact is often invisible precisely because it wasn't loud. Younger artists could afford to be bold because someone like Mathis managed to survive while navigating a world where there was no safety net for honesty. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is how much of his life was spent carefully guarding himself while singing about love. But the triumph is undeniable. Johnny Mathis remained on stage, in recordings, and in legacy lists for more than 60 years, becoming a blueprint for living one's truth, slowly, quietly, and ultimately freely. Long after the scandals and headlines that defined other artists fade away, Mathis stands as proof that courage sometimes arrives in whispers rather than declarations. Case 7. Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart stepped into the spotlight with an energy that felt almost futuristic, a blend of R&B swagger and club culture confidence wrapped in a frame that never apologized for being different. In the mid-1980s, while the charts were dominated by blockbuster ballads and polished studio gloss, Stewart arrived with something utterly infectious. "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," a song that sounded like fun but carried a sly message of confidence, boundaries, and self-respect. He was part of a wave of young artists shaped by dance floors, DJs, and underground style, and even before mainstream audiences knew his name, people inside the industry already whispered about him with a kind of knowing respect. Stewart never issued a press release proclaiming who he was. Instead, he lived it in plain sight. In an era when being openly gay in R&B could crush a career before it began, Stewart treated authenticity not as a scandal, but as a stage presence. Appearing in interviews and magazine features with a cool, unapologetic tone that felt revolutionary, even if it flew under the radar of mainstream pop culture. The deeper you look at his life, the more you realize how much courage it took to simply be himself. Stewart came up in the same Chicago club environment that produced house music, where queer Black expression wasn't an exception. It was culture. When he finally reached national recognition, Billboard magazine didn't frame him as controversial, but rather as a creative force coming straight from the world that had been shaping dance music for years. Still, the price of that openness was real. Executives didn't always know what to do with him, and airplay politics in the late 80s were harsh toward queer identities, especially those that weren't coded or hidden. As trends shifted and radio grew more conservative, Stewart found himself in the painful limbo so many LGBTQ+ artists have experienced, adored by insider communities, but overlooked by the mainstream institutions that should have protected his talent. Yet, his insistence on presenting himself authentically helped build a quiet, lasting movement of queer visibility inside R&B, long before it had language, hashtags, or public solidarity. His story is not a simple rise and fall narrative, but something far more human. Stewart's success meant something bigger than chart positions. For countless queer Black listeners, especially young men who didn't see themselves reflected anywhere in pop culture, he represented possibility, proof that someone like them could step into a spotlight without erasing who they were. Long after the hits faded, his legacy lived on in small, unspoken ways. In underground queer clubs where people danced to his music as a form of affirmation, in interviews from later generations of artists who quietly pointed to him as an influence, in documentaries and retrospectives that now acknowledge how ahead of his time he really was. His career never exploded into a global empire, but it didn't have to. The cultural shift he helped begin was enough. Stewart's life reminds us that visibility is its own kind of revolution, especially when the world tries to hide you. He showed up, showed who he was, and changed R&B history without ever asking for permission. Case 8. B. Slade. There is a moment in modern R&B history that feels like a fault line. The night Tonex, one of gospel's most innovative, genre-bending voices, sat down for a raw interview and said the words the industry never expected to hear. "Yes, I'm attracted to men." It wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. It wasn't a scandal secretly taped or leaked. It was deliberate, calm, and devastatingly honest. For decades, the gospel community had celebrated his vocal acrobatics, his theatrical live shows, and his soulful songwriting, but they never knew the internal war he was fighting behind closed doors. Raised in a church culture where identity was something to be hidden, where perfection was marketed as purity. Tonex learned early that talent could take you far, but silence was the real currency of the gospel world, and he spent years paying with pieces of himself. By the time he released songs like Make Me Over, Tonex wasn't just another gospel singer chasing radio play. He was shaping culture. He was young, creative, stylish, and the kind of voice that made industry veterans whisper the phrase, "next legend." But pressure was growing. Interviews became minefields. Every award show and choir convention felt like a room where he had to rehearse authenticity while hiding his truth. When he finally came out publicly in 2009, first speaking candidly on BET, then doubling down in long-form conversations online, it sent shockwaves through gospel circles. Fans were stunned, church leaders scrambled for statements, and former collaborators suddenly distanced themselves without explanation. He wasn't accused of a crime, and he hadn't hurt anyone. But in an industry built on unspoken rules, his admission was treated like betrayal. The fallout came fast. Bookings were quietly canceled. Invitations to major gospel award shows evaporated. Radio airplay slowed to silence. Tonex spoke openly about the heartbreak of being loved for his gifts but rejected for his truth. It felt surreal. One month he was celebrated as one of the most gifted men in gospel music. The next, he was practically erased by the same gatekeepers who once promised to elevate him. That season of exile forced a transformation. Tonex reintroduced himself to the world under a new name, B. Slade. He switched from gospel to experimental R&B, hip-hop, theater, and studio production. He became the man behind other people's hits. He embraced creativity without boundaries, becoming a songwriter and vocal producer for mainstream artists who appreciated the very genius the gospel industry once depended on. The most startling part of his story is that he never walked away from faith. What changed was the system surrounding it. Interviews from that period are filled with heartbreaking clarity, him describing how God saved him, music raised him, and the church nearly broke him. His career after coming out wasn't a collapse, it was a reinvention. He toured independently, he dropped mixtapes, studio albums, and stage shows with total artistic freedom, and every time he recorded a vocal, you heard the same dynamic range he was once praised for, only now it wasn't filtered through fear. Over time, younger, queer gospel and R&B artists pointed to B. Slade as proof that honesty could survive even after controversy. Today, his legacy is complicated only if you view it through the lens of an industry that never made room for truth. In the larger story of Black R&B and gospel, Tonex's transformation into B. Slade marks a turning point. It proved one person could carry both calling and identity without apology, and whether the traditional gospel world ever acknowledges the loss, the impact remains. A generation of LGBTQ+ Black artists saw someone walk through fire, lose nearly everything, and still find a way to create, to sing, and to live. Case 9. Kehlani. There was never anything quiet or hesitant about the moment Kehlani chose to speak her truth. It didn't come in a staged press conference or a glossy magazine feature. It came through a simple Instagram post, written in her own words, in her own voice, declaring that she was queer. Not confined to labels, not limited to expectations, not apologizing for existing outside the narrow boxes the R&B industry had tried to place her in. At the time, Kehlani was already a rapidly rising star with the kind of commercial momentum most artists dream of, charting singles, collaborations with major acts, and a fast-growing fan base that related to her vulnerable storytelling and soulful vocal style. But behind the scenes, she understood something many artists before her had learned the hard way. There are parts of personal identity that can become targets, especially in R&B, a space where sexuality has historically been policed, hidden, or filtered through a heteronormative lens to stay marketable. Her announcement wasn't a dramatic spectacle, and that alone made it powerful. She spoke casually, honestly, about loving people of all genders, rejecting binary thinking, and embracing the fluidity of her own experience. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive among younger fans, particularly queer listeners who saw themselves in her. But alongside that praise came the predictable backlash from certain corners of R&B culture, where conversations about identity often turned judgmental and invasive. Kehlani never publicly begged for acceptance. Instead, she leaned into her authenticity with even more conviction. What looked like vulnerability was actually strength, and it shifted her public image from rising R&B star to a modern voice of queer representation in mainstream music. Coming out didn't suddenly erase her struggles. Kehlani has been open about battles with depression, anxiety, and coping habits that once threatened to derail her career. But rather than hide those issues, she used interviews and music to confront them directly. Songs and public statements reflected a woman determined to survive, to heal, and to model self-honesty in a genre where masking pain has been an unwritten requirement for decades. Where older artists had been forced to bury identity, Kehlani insisted on another path. An unapologetic transparency that resonated with a new generation of fans who refused to treat sexuality as scandal. One of the most significant impacts of Kehlani's openness is the way it transformed her relationship with her audience. Instead of losing commercial support, she gained deeper loyalty, particularly from young queer listeners who rarely saw themselves represented authentically in R&B. Industry critics began recognizing her not only for her vocal ability and songwriting, but also for her cultural significance. She wasn't just talking publicly about being queer, she was living it, defending it, normalizing it. Interviews emphasized not just coming out, but staying out, visibly, continuously, even when internet noise tried to drown out the message. Today, her career stands as living proof that honesty can open doors rather than close them. She continues releasing music, touring, and collaborating with artists who value authenticity over image, shifting conversations in spaces where silence used to be the rule. She became a model for how mainstream R&B can evolve, not by abandoning its past, but by acknowledging the identities that were always present but rarely acknowledged. Kehlani didn't just come out, she changed the expectation of what happens next. Case 10. Kaytranada. The moment that changed everything for Kaytranada didn't happen on stage or in a recording studio surrounded by synth pads and headphones. It happened in silence, when a rising producer who had already remixed everyone from Janet Jackson to the internet, realized he was carrying a secret that was eating away at his sanity. Born Louis Kevin Celestine, Kaytranada grew up in a Haitian-Canadian household where masculinity was tightly defined and the idea of being queer was whispered about as something distant, almost forbidden. Even as his beats exploded online as he developed that unmistakable rhythm, house drums, R&B soul, Afro-Caribbean bass lines, something in him stayed tightly guarded. He could make music that set dance floors on fire, but he couldn't say aloud who he truly was. That pressure built quietly behind the scenes. In interviews leading up to his breakthrough album 99.9%, Kaytranada dodged personal questions, instead talking about production, inspirations, and the joy of collaborating with artists he admired. But when he finally sat down for an interview with The Fader, he let the truth out for the first time. He said plainly that he was gay, and tired of hiding it. That interview hit the music world like a shockwave, not because people couldn't imagine a queer producer in R&B and hip-hop, but because someone at the top of his game finally said it openly and without apology. Kaytranada admitted he feared rejection, especially from Black communities and hip-hop circles where homophobia often lingered beneath the surface. Yet, he also made it clear he wasn't going back into silence again. After that moment, the tone of his career changed. Fans didn't walk away, many of them rallied around him. He became a symbol in real time, a queer black man reshaping modern dance and R&B music without erasing any part of himself. If anything, the honesty clarified his sound. The freedom in tracks like Light Spots, Glowed Up, and You're the One suddenly felt more personal. He began talking openly about how internal anxiety had shaped his choices, how depression and fear once made world tours feel suffocating, and how coming out lifted a quiet weight off every creative decision he made. Kaytranada's public honesty didn't eliminate critics or erase uncomfortable conversations. It started them. He talked about relatives who still didn't understand. He mentioned friends who didn't know how to respond at first. But he kept working. Harder, cleaner, more focused. He didn't just release more music, he became someone other queer artists pointed to as proof that telling the truth wouldn't destroy them. His openness made certain collaborations feel different too, bringing nuance into a space where vulnerability is often hidden behind beats and bravado. The impact on his legacy is unfolding in real time. He is still young, still evolving, and still building a career defined not only by talent but by transparency. Kaytranada's story is not about a dramatic scandal or a tabloid headline. It is about living long enough to stop pretending and watching the world, surprisingly, embrace him for it. He proved that a black man in R&B, hip-hop, and electronic music could be openly queer and still command respect on every festival stage in the world. In a genre where so many suffered silently for decades, Kaytranada's choice to come out publicly didn't just free him. It offered something rare: hope. If you're still watching, stick around. One final moment remains, the closing narration where we tie everything together and ask you the question that matters most. The narrative closes with a reminder that music has always been more than a soundtrack to people's lives. It is a reflection of identity, pain, pride, secrecy, and liberation. Every one of these artists carried a truth that the industry once demanded they hide, and when they finally spoke up, something shifted permanently in the culture. From Sylvester's unapologetic stage presence in the 1970s to Kaytranada's candid admission just a few years ago, the movement has taken generations. These stories aren't about scandal or shock, they're about courage. They represent what it costs to stand in the open when success depends on silence. These artists navigated a world where managers warned them to stay quiet, where labels threatened their careers, where audiences weren't ready. And yet, they spoke anyway. Some paid a price, losing radio play or industry support. Others found new audiences who connected more deeply once the mask came off. Today, their influence is obvious in the music, the culture, and the artists now building on their legacy. Before we end, think about this. Do you believe the music industry has truly become a safe place for LGBTQ+ artists to tell their stories? Or are there still pressures to hide? Drop your thoughts, opinions, and personal experiences in the comments. We really want to hear from you. And if you've been feeling these deep-dive, long-form music documentaries, the kind that don't just talk about hits but reveal the human stories behind the artists, then do one simple thing that helps this channel more than anything else: subscribe to Savage Case Files. That one click lets us keep uncovering history, telling the truth, and putting out new episodes every single week. Thanks for watching, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next one.